The convoy of trucks rattled through the gates of the American camp, carrying a group rarely seen in the war, Japanese female prisoners of war. Their uniforms were ragged, faces streaked with dust and exhaustion, their bodies worn thin by weeks of marches and surrender. Most had been nurses, clerks, or auxiliaries. They had been taught to expect cruelty from the Americans, to fear dishonor worse than death. The whispers among them spoke of assault, of humiliation, of fates too dark to imagine. As they stepped down from the trucks, the women tightened their grips on their bundles, avoiding the stares of American soldiers. Yet the scene before them was not the nightmare they had been told to expect. The camp was orderly, clean, with neat rows of barracks and barbed wire fences glinting in the sun. The guards stood tall, well-built, uniforms pressed, rifles slung casually. Their posture was firm, but their eyes betrayed curiosity rather than cruelty. The women lowered their gazes, expecting barked commands. Instead, the guards gestured calmly, pointing them toward the processing station. Translators explained in broken Japanese that they would be registered, examined, and given supplies. Suspicion spread like fire among them. Was this kindness real, or only the prelude to humiliation? Their commanders had warned them, better to die than to fall into American hands. Yet here no hands reached for them in anger. Inside the camp hall they were given food and water. A nurse prisoner later wrote in her diary, "I drank, but my hands trembled. I believe the cup must be poisoned. Yet nothing happened. Only silence, only order." For the first time, the women allowed themselves to glance at the American soldiers more closely. Broad shoulders, strong jaws, eyes that lingered not with malice, but with something softer interest. One woman whispered to another, "They look at us strangely, not as enemies, but as if we are something else." The words brought nervous giggles, quickly silenced by shame. The tension was unbearable. To be stared at by armed men was expected, but to be stared at with curiosity, even admiration, was something none of them had prepared for. That night, lying on wooden bunks, the women whispered in hushed tones. What did the soldiers see in them? Why did their eyes seem less filled with hate and more with questions? One prisoner recorded in her diary, "It was more frightening than anger. They looked at us as if we were women, not enemies. I did not know whether to feel fear or shame." It was the beginning of a paradox they could not escape. They had expected violence and contempt. Instead, they found themselves caught in the unspoken tension of glances that felt far more complicated. The shock of captivity had only begun. The following morning, the women lined up under the watchful eyes of guards. Their bodies ached from fatigue, their uniforms stiff with dirt. They braced for insults, for the contempt they had been warned of. Instead, an American sergeant barked orders for them to step forward. Translators explained each woman would receive a blanket, a towel, and fresh water. The women stared in disbelief. Blankets? Towels? Such comforts had been stripped from them long before surrender. To be given them now by the enemy felt surreal, almost mocking. One nurse later recalled, "When the soldier handed me the blanket, his hands did not shake with anger. He simply placed it in my arms as though I was a person, not a prisoner. I could not meet his eyes." The guards escorted them to the mess hall. Bowls of food awaited, bread, beans, coffee. The smell itself was overwhelming. They hesitated, convinced it was a trick. But when they ate, nothing happened. No cruelty, no poison, no hidden blow. Only food, warm and plentiful. Some prisoners wept silently, unable to reconcile this with the stories they had been told. The American soldiers watched quietly, their expressions unreadable. Yet in their eyes was something that unsettled the women, More than hostility, it was recognition. One of the women whispered, "They look at us as women. I see it in their faces. How can this be? We are enemies." Her voice cracked between fear and confusion. A soldier, passing with a tray, nodded slightly, almost politely. It was not the gesture of a man addressing a prisoner, but of one acknowledging another human being. The camp routine soon became clearer. Roll calls, assigned bunks, strict discipline. Yet within the order, small cracks appeared. A guard offered an extra ladle of beans. Another dropped a folded note in broken Japanese. "Be strong." These gestures were not grand, but they were enough to unsettle the women deeply. For kindness from the enemy was harder to endure than cruelty. It stirred emotions they had sworn to bury. A diary entry captured the moment. I feared fists. Instead, I received water. I feared anger. Instead, I saw eyes filled with something I cannot name. This is more dangerous than hatred. In those first weeks, the women discovered that captivity was not shaped by violence, but by something far more complicated. Unexpected kindness that blurred the lines between duty and desire. It was the first step toward a revelation none of them had imagined. By the third week of captivity, the routines of the camp were clear. Roll calls at dawn, work assignments during the day, meals taken in strict silence. Yet beneath the order, something subtler unfolded, glances that lingered longer than they should. The American guards, tall and broad-shouldered, watched the women not only with suspicion, but with something more difficult to disguise. Their eyes often lingered as the women walked past, their expressions softening in ways that unsettled the captives. One female POW whispered to her comrade, "They do not see us as enemies. They look at us as men look at women. Is that not more dangerous?" Her voice trembled, unsure if she felt insulted or strangely flattered. The women had been raised in a culture where obedience and modesty defined them. To be stared at so openly by soldiers of the enemy felt both humiliating and strangely humanizing. A diary entry captured the tension. When I lowered my eyes, he did not shout. He smiled. It was worse than anger, for in his smile I saw that he had forgotten I was a prisoner. The glances grew bolder. At the water lines, guards offered to carry buckets. At the mess hall, some handed extra bread, slipping it discreetly. Their uniforms and strong arms radiated a kind of strength that the women could not ignore. Confusion spread among the prisoners. Should they feel shame? Fear? Or was there a part of them, starved of kindness after years of war, that responded in ways they dared not admit? One nurse recalled later, "They were well built, tall, their faces foreign. I feared them, yet my heart beat strangely when their eyes met mine. I hated myself for this weakness." The Americans, too, seemed conflicted. Their orders demanded discipline, but their stares betrayed curiosity, even desire. They laughed softly when the women looked away, as though embarrassed by their own thoughts. The women realized they were caught in an unspoken tension. They were prisoners, yes, but also women, and the men guarding them were not blind to that fact. At night, the barracks filled with hushed whispers. Some women wept in shame. Others admitted quietly that the attention felt strangely comforting after months of fear and hardship. The realization was undeniable. The war had reduced them to captives, but the eyes of the American soldiers reminded them of something they had not felt in years, what it meant to be seen, and soon those glances would become something more. The lines between captor and captive were beginning to blur. At night, after roll call and lights out, the barracks filled with whispers. The women lay on their bunks, staring at the ceiling, the day's events still fresh in their minds. Some could not shake the memory of the soldiers' eyes, glances that felt too long, too warm for guards. They whispered of smiles caught in passing, of bread offered without request, of words spoken gently rather than harshly. But not all saw these gestures the same way. Some argued they were traps, ways to soften resistance, to humiliate them further. Fear and suspicion clung tightly to their pride. A diary captured the debate. One of us says the soldiers look kindly. Another says they only mean to mock. I cannot tell who is right. I only know my heart feels restless, and that frightens me more than hunger. Others admitted, in voices barely above a breath, that the attention stirred something unfamiliar after years of war. They were women who had lived through hunger, marches, and bombardments. To be looked at as women again, was it weakness or a reminder of humanity? One nurse, clutching her blanket, confessed softly, "When he handed me water, I felt my cheeks burn. I hate myself for it, but I cannot deny it." The barracks divided into two groups, those who feared and rejected the glances, and those who, though ashamed, admitted they felt curiosity. Some even speculated in secret. What if the Americans truly saw them as more than prisoners? The whispers grew bolder with time. They spoke of the soldiers' strength, their height, their strange accents. Some wondered if their attention was fleeting or if it meant something deeper. One woman, older and stern, warned, "Do not be deceived. They are our enemy. Their kindness will destroy what little honor we have." Left her words silenced many, but not all. Even those who resisted the thought could not stop the feeling. Each day, the stares, the small gestures, the subtle smiles made the line between captor and captive thinner. The women began to notice who the soldiers were. One with dark hair, who always offered blankets. Another who lingered longer at the gate, his eyes softer than his voice. They gave them nicknames in secret, a dangerous game in whispers. Shame hung heavy in the barracks. Yet beneath the shame, a reluctant truth spread. They were no longer invisible, no longer only prisoners. They were seen and remembered by the very men who guarded them. And for the first time since their capture, some of the women began to wonder not only what it meant to be prisoners, but what it meant to be women again. The whispers in the barracks were the first cracks in their resolve, and soon those cracks would widen into something undeniable. Day after day, the routines of camp life unfolded with mechanical precision. Yet within those routines, it was the smallest gestures that lingered longest in the women's minds. At the mess hall, an extra slice of bread slipped onto a tray. On cold nights, a blanket folded more carefully than the others. At the water line, a soldier who lifted a heavy bucket before she could struggle with it. For the Americans, these may have been simple courtesies. But for the women, who had been taught to expect only cruelty, each act carried a weight far greater than its size. One nurse recorded in her diary, "When he placed the bread in my hand, I felt my eyes burn. I had marched through jungles without food, yet here, the enemy gave me more than my own army ever had." The women debated endlessly whether these acts were genuine or manipulative. Some whispered they were tactics to soften their will. Others admitted, reluctantly, that they felt kindness in them. The soldiers, too, seemed aware of their own contradictions. They barked orders sharply, yet their eyes softened when a woman stumbled or shivered. Their discipline held, but their humanity slipped through in moments they could not disguise. One soldier, broad-shouldered and sunburned, folded a blanket and set it carefully on a bunk. The woman who received it avoided his eyes, yet later confessed to her bunkmate, "I felt his care more than the cloth itself." To men hardened by war, these women were supposed to be the enemy. Yet the looks, the gestures, The hesitant smiles revealed something forbidden, admiration, even affection. The women felt it too, though few dared admit it. The gestures reminded them of a world before the war, of kindness, of men who looked without anger, of evenings when they had once been seen as women, not soldiers or prisoners. Shame mixed with warmth, fear with longing. The paradox gnawed at them in silence. To feel gratitude toward the enemy was betrayal, yet to deny the comfort of those small gestures was impossible. One diary captured the torment. I hate that I waited for his smile, that I noticed his strength. But the war has taken everything from me. His glance gave me back something small, something human. I do not know how to name it. For the Americans, perhaps these gestures were nothing more than habits of decency. But for the prisoners, they became symbols of something larger, an unspoken current running between captor and captive. The war had made them enemies. The camp made them prisoners. But the gestures, bread, blankets, water, made them something else entirely. And soon those gestures would begin to transform into something even more dangerous. Affection. 1616. By early autumn, the silence that once hung heavy between captor and captive began to shift. Words were still rare, but the eyes spoke freely, and sometimes the lips followed. At first, it was fleeting. A soldier handing out trays in the mess hall let his gaze linger longer than duty required. A woman receiving the tray allowed herself, for the briefest second, to meet his eyes. The corners of his mouth curved upward. Not the grin of mockery, but the quiet smile of recognition. She lowered her eyes instantly, ashamed, yet her heart raced in a way she had not felt in years. Others noticed it too. Soldiers who once barked orders now softened their tone, their voices carrying less bite. Women who once turned their backs now risked small glances, sometimes returning the faintest hint of a smile. One diary confessed, "I told myself it was only courtesy, yet my heart betrayed me." I smiled back. It was the first time in years I remembered I was still a woman. In the camp, even the smallest gestures carried enormous weight. A soldier pausing an extra second while handing a blanket. A woman brushing her hair more carefully before roll call. These were signals, silent but unmistakable. The guards knew discipline forbade them from crossing lines, yet desire, once awakened, was difficult to disguise. Their shoulders straightened, their words grew softer, their eyes gave them away. The women were caught between shame and curiosity. They whispered in the barracks at night, "Did you see how he looked at you? Did you notice how he smiled?" Laughter mixed with unease, as though to name it aloud would break some fragile balance. A nurse wrote quietly, "I hated that I smiled. I hated that he smiled. Yet I could not stop it." That single moment carried more warmth than all the years of war. The camp buzzed with unspoken tension. What had begun as fear was transforming into something else, something more dangerous, because it could not be ordered away. The Americans' smiles betrayed their hearts, and the women's returning glances betrayed theirs. For both, it was the beginning of something forbidden, an affection neither side dared name, yet neither side could deny. The war had built walls of hatred. Now, within the barbed wire, a crack had opened. And through that crack, something unexpected was growing. The first words came quietly, almost by accident. At the waterline, a soldier filling canteens glanced toward one of the women. His English was simple, deliberate. "Cold today?" She froze, unsure if she had heard correctly. For weeks, silence had been their shield. Yet now an American soldier was speaking not as a guard, but as a man making conversation. Her reply came in broken English. whispered so softly she barely heard herself. Yes. Cold? She lowered her eyes instantly, cheeks burning, ashamed at the sound of her own voice. From then on, small fragments of language began to pass between the two sides. A word at the food line. Good, answered with a shy nod. A question at the gate. Tired? Met with a faint smile. One woman later confessed in her diary, when I spoke to him, I felt disloyal, yet I also felt alive. It was as if the war had vanished, if only for a second. The guards' discipline wavered in these moments. They knew such exchanges were forbidden, that to treat prisoners with familiarity invited punishment. Yet the words slipped through anyway. Impossible to stop. At night, the women replayed these fragments in their minds, repeating the strange foreign sounds. They whispered them in the barracks, half in laughter, half in longing. Cold, tired. Good simple words, but filled with meanings unspoken. Some women warned each other not to be deceived. They are only words. Do not believe them, but even they could not deny the strange warmth that lingered after hearing them. The soldiers, too, seemed changed. Their eyes softened. Their voices lost their harsh edge. They asked questions not out of duty, but out of interest. And when the women answered, even clumsily, they smiled in quiet satisfaction. One diary captured it perfectly. It was not the bread, nor the blanket, nor the smile. It was the words. To hear them speak to us as humans, not prisoners, broke something inside me. I could not forget it. The camp had rules, but the human heart followed none. Every word exchanged was dangerous, every glance a risk. And yet the words kept coming. What began as silence had now become whispers, and what began as whispers was slowly becoming conversations. In those forbidden words, affection took root, fragile, forbidden, and unstoppable. The line between duty and desire was blurring with every word spoken. 2246. By now, the camp was alive with whispers. The women spoke quietly in their barracks, and the guards exchanged knowing glances among themselves. What had begun as subtle smiles and brief words was becoming too obvious to ignore. Rumors spread quickly. Some women were said to have received folded notes in broken Japanese. Others claimed they had been offered extra rations, not by accident, but by intent. In the dim barracks, these whispers became both entertainment and anxiety. One woman confessed, "He gave me his bread." Another replied sharply, "Do not speak of it. If the officers hear, we will all suffer." The guards, too, were not blind to what was happening. Some smirked quietly at their comrades, teasing them about the way they lingered near certain barracks. Others frowned, worried that their discipline was cracking. One American corporal wrote in a letter home, "They are not like the men we captured. They are women, frightened but proud. Some of the boys, they look at them differently. I fear what might come of it." The Japanese women, meanwhile, lived with divided emotions. Some felt shame, insisting that to receive kindness from the enemy was dishonor. Others admitted in hushed tones that the attention made them feel human again. Arguments broke out. One night, a woman accused her bunkmate. "You smiled at him. You dishonor us." The accused lowered her head, but whispered, "He looked at me as if I was not a prisoner." For a moment, I was free. The guards noticed the tension, too. They exchanged nervous jokes, but beneath the humor lay unease. They were soldiers sworn to discipline, yet their hearts betrayed them in ways their rifles could not control. In time, the rumors reached camp officers. Rules tightened, restrictions on movement, stricter roll calls, harsher warnings. But no rule could erase what had already begun. A diary captured the atmosphere. We fear discovery, yet we cannot hide the truth. The soldiers' eyes betray them, and perhaps ours do too. The rumors are like smoke. We cannot contain them. Whispers swirled through the camp like an invisible current. Some feared it would bring punishment. Others secretly hoped it might bring something more. The lines of war had been drawn in blood. Now they were being redrawn in glances, gestures, and rumors impossible to silence. By then, both sides understood the truth. Affection had entered the camp, and once spoken of, it could no longer be undone. Rumors had turned the unspoken into something undeniable. By late winter, the walls of discipline still stood tall, but inside the barbed wire, silence itself had become a language. Affection was not declared. It was hidden in gestures too small to punish, but too powerful to ignore. At mealtime, a soldier placed an extra slice of bread on a tray, his hand brushing hers for just a second too long. Neither spoke, but both knew it meant something more than rations. At the waterline, a guard carried a bucket farther than necessary, setting it down near one woman with a faint smile. She bowed her head, not daring to speak, yet the warmth of the gesture stayed with her all night. One prisoner recorded quietly in her diary, "There are no words. Only eyes, only hands, only the smallest of moments. But in them I feel something I thought the war had taken from me. Tenderness." The Americans, too, carried the burden of silence. They joked among themselves, but in quiet moments, their eyes betrayed longing. They knew to touch, to speak too openly, would bring punishment. Yet still they lingered near the women's barracks longer than orders required. The women whispered about these moments each night. They laughed nervously, teased each other, and yet admitted, sometimes through tears, that they felt their hearts stir with emotions they had been taught to bury. For many, it was more dangerous than hunger or fear. To feel human again, to feel seen, was a temptation greater than any cruelty. One nurse wrote, "It was not love as we once knew it. It was love trapped in silence, love that could not be spoken, only carried in the smallest acts. As weeks passed, those acts became rituals. A folded blanket left more neatly than the others, a smile shared at the gate, a soft word in broken Japanese. Each moment was fleeting, but together they formed something undeniable. The women knew the danger, the soldiers knew the rules, but still affection bloomed, not with passion, not with declarations, but with the quiet power of silence. The war had stripped them of freedom, of honor, of certainty. Yet within the fences it had left them one thing they never expected: hearts still capable of feeling. And in the stillness of those moments, love, impossible, forbidden, yet real, was born. It was affection too fragile to speak aloud, but too strong to be denied. The silence had become their language, and through it they discovered that even in captivity, the human heart refused to surrender. When the war ended, the camp gates opened, not for freedom, but for departure. The women were gathered, their belongings returned, their names recorded one last time. Trucks waited to carry them toward the ports. As they stepped forward, many dared to lift their eyes toward the soldiers who had guarded them. Some exchanged final glances, fleeting, silent goodbyes spoken only through the eyes. No words were allowed. A diary captured the moment. He looked at me once more as I boarded the truck. There was no smile, only sorrow. I lowered my eyes, but my heart ached as though I was leaving something behind. The soldiers stood rigid, but inside they too felt the weight. They had seen these women not only as prisoners, but as human beings. Some had felt more, emotions they dared not admit, even to themselves. On the long voyage home, the women sat in silence, staring at the sea. Their hearts wrestled with contradictions. They had been captives of the enemy, yet within captivity they had glimpsed kindness, tenderness, even love. In Japan, few spoke of it. To admit that American soldiers had looked at them with admiration, even affection, was to invite shame. The memories became secrets, carried privately, never written in official records. Yet decades later, when historians interviewed survivors, fragments emerged. A nurse confessed, "I hated myself for it, but I remember his eyes more than his rifle. In that camp, I was a prisoner, but for moments, I was also a woman." For the soldiers, the memories lingered too. Letters home hinted at beautiful faces among the captives, written carefully between lines of duty and silence. None dared tell the full truth, but the feelings lived on in memory. The irony was sharp. In a war defined by hatred, in camps defined by fences, love had dared to appear, fragile, forbidden, and unforgettable. For the Japanese women, the memory was bittersweet. They carried scars of war, but also memories of small gestures, bread offered, blankets folded, smiles shared. Affection that crossed enemy lines. Historians would later call it paradox. For those who lived it, it was more personal. A secret reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, the heart refuses to obey the rules of war. The war ended, nations rebuilt. But in the quiet of their private thoughts, many never forgot the strange truth of those years. That in the unlikeliest of places, behind barbed wire, among enemies, Japanese female POWs had discovered that even soldiers could look at them not as captives, but as women. And in those forbidden glances, they had felt something they never expected: love.